Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into something genuinely mind-blowing. We're going to explore how 19th century Russian realism, a massive literary movement born during the time of empires and czars, actually acts as the ultimate diagnostic source code for understanding human capital today. It turns out, long before modern psychology or computer science even existed, these epic narratives were already mapping out the complex architecture of the human mind.
So here is the massive question we're tackling. How exactly did two 19th century Russian novelists predict the ethical crises of 21st century artificial intelligence? I know, it sounds like a wild stretch, right? But believe it or not, these 150-year-old texts provide the exact framework we need for navigating today's modern algorithmic crises. As we'll see, the ethical dilemmas of the 1860s are literally the exact same dilemmas we face when programming machines to make moral choices today.
Here's our roadmap for the explainer. We'll hit the 19th century intellectual cauldron, the clash between Westernizers and Slavophiles, Tolstoy's macro-historical epic, Dostoevsky's subterranean psychological audit, and wrap it all up with the tyranny of pure algorithms.
Section 1. The 19th century intellectual cauldron. To really get this, we have to drop ourselves right into the vast, highly volatile landscape of the 1860s Russian Empire. Talk about a society trying to rewrite its entire operating system overnight. Under Tsar Alexander II, Russia was dealing with massive structural shock. First, they suffer a humiliating military defeat in the Crimean War in the 1850s, which forces this aggressive push for modernization. Then, the absolute macro event hits. The 1861 Emancipation Reform liberates millions of serfs. This basically engineered a huge economic vacuum, driving massive urban population spikes into hub municipalities like St. Petersburg. You have this sudden, rapid urbanization, which created the perfect storm for profound philosophical chaos.
And right into this vacuum steps the university crowd. The student demographic rapidly adopted these incredibly radical, imported Western frameworks. We're talking nihilism, utopian socialism, and scientific atheism. Their core objective? The total liquidation of legacy moral, religious, and familial traditions. They literally wanted to tear down the old world and execute pure, unanchored utilitarian reason, believing cold logic alone could perfectly optimize society.
Section 2. Westernizers versus Slavophiles.
This systemic trauma and influx of radical ideas completely fractured the Russian intelligentsia. It was a massive ideological turf war. On one side, you had the Westernizers. They believed Russia had to systematically emulate Western Europe by adopting scientific progress, economic liberalism, and materialist philosophy. But pushing right back were the Slavophiles. They argued that Russia commanded a totally unique spiritual mission, one anchored deeply in Eastern Orthodox theology, rustic communal infrastructure, and traditional morals. It's the ultimate clash, adopting a Western materialist paradigm versus preserving an Eastern spiritual infrastructure.
To process this insane intellectual environment, the culture consolidated around two absolute literary titans. But they operated with completely opposite creative strategies. Think of it as the macro-auditor versus the micro-auditor. First, we have Leo Tolstoy, a high-level aristocrat and combat veteran who analyzed panoramic historical data streams and massive social macro systems. And on the flip side, we have Fyodor Dostoevsky. This is a guy who survived a state death sentence and years of forced labor isolation. Dostoevsky didn't look at the macro. He audited the subterranean microsystems, completely penetrating the urban underbelly to study criminal minds.
Section 3. Tolstoy's macro-historical epic.
Let's start with Tolstoy. In his masterpiece, War and Peace, he plots this vast geopolitical grid during the Napoleonic invasions. He brilliantly contrasts two completely different environments. On one hand, you have the St. Petersburg ballrooms, where the core metric is just prestige signaling, leading to entirely feudal high society operations. But contrast that with the battlefields of Austerlitz and Borodino. Out there, the only metric that matters is tactical survival, resulting in raw, unrefined brutality. He seamlessly connects the fates of entire nations to this localized behavioral psychology.
Right at the operational core of this huge epic is an unaligned asset named Pierre Bezukhov. Pierre is frantically searching for a stable life metric. He tries everything to find meaning, and it actually peaks in this completely rogue, absurd mission where he tries to single-handedly assassinate Napoleon. No way, right? But the fascinating part is what happens next. He gets captured by French forces, and that capture strips away his westernized pride. In the brutal conditions of a prisoner camp, simple contact with an ordinary peasant finally connects him to the practical, grounded reality he couldn't find in high society.
Which brings us to Tolstoy's ultimate thesis. He establishes a strict historical fatalism, basically arguing that macro history is never actually engineered by so-called great men or sovereign generals like Napoleon. Instead, historical momentum is driven by the organic determinism of millions of imperceptible localized human actions. For Tolstoy, an optimal executive, like the Russian general Kutuzov, doesn't try to force control over macro events. Instead, he seamlessly integrates into that shifting organic flow of reality.
Section 4. Dostoevsky's Subterranean Psychological Audit.
All right, pivoting away from Tolstoy's massive panoramic architecture, we now dive into Dostoevsky. In Crime and Punishment, the focus is entirely on the fluid, highly volatile contradictions of the individual mind. We meet Raskolnikov, a brilliant former law student operating in an acute subsistence crisis, basically crushing poverty. Contaminated by rationalist nihilism, he engineers this terrifying proprietary theory, the theory of the extraordinary executive. He convinces himself that humanity is divided and that innovative geniuses actually possess the sovereign moral right to completely breach legal compliance and commit crimes as long as it serves a macro-systemic good. To stress test this theory, Raskolnikov actually executes a brutal double-axe murder. But here's where the system breaks down. Instead of feeling like some superior Napoleonic mastermind, his internal apparatus completely fails. He cascades into a permanent feedback loop of feverish paranoia, mental stasis, and extreme guilt. Dostoevsky shows us that the real punishment isn't the police, it's the mind literally torturing itself, which means Raskolnikov eventually needs to find a way towards structural optimization and rebirth.
So how does he fix this broken internal system? Well, it takes a high-stakes psychological chess match with a brilliant magistrate to completely de-optimize his emotional defenses. But the real turning point is his confession to Sonia, a young woman who sacrifices everything to sustain her family. She is the ultimate pure asset. She actually accompanies him to punitive isolation in the Siberian galleys, and it's only there, by voluntarily accepting his punishment and experiencing her unconditional love, that he achieves a complete spiritual rebirth anchored in the teachings of the Gospels. He realizes he's just a baseline human asset, and he can't bear the cognitive load of his crime without self-sacrificing alignment.
Dostoevsky's overarching lesson here is profound. Genuine moral optimization requires voluntary suffering and love, not some calculated grid of competitive advantages. He empirically demonstrated that isolated, logical reason is a highly dangerous asset. If you try to steer human capital using nothing but absolute detached logic, you will steer society straight into absolute moral horror. Humans are fundamentally distinct from mathematical machines.
Okay, so you might be asking yourself, what on earth does a fictional 1860s axe murder teach us about artificial intelligence? How do these 19th century audits map onto our 21st century technological landscape? Let's connect the dots.
Section 5. The Tyranny of Pure Algorithms.
It is wild how accurately the diagnostics engineered by Russian realism reverberate in our modern ethical debates. Think about how we currently build our systems, heavily over-indexing on pure, logical, utilitarian algorithms, giving them, say, 80% of the priority, while barely leaving 20% for human empathy, fragility, and spiritual data. This is exactly the technocentric hubris that Dostoevsky was screaming about. He knew that attempting to bypass human empathy in favor of calculated logic would lead to massive, catastrophic system failures.
These 19th century texts are literally the source code for modern systems. The Russian forensic audit of the human psyche anticipated Freud's foundational psychoanalysis metrics by decades. It completely predated the existentialist networks of Sartre and Camus. In Raskolnikov's theory, that's the exact blueprint for modern corporate and political radicalization. The idea that the ends justify the means and that cold logic can bypass ethical boundaries. Ultimately, it exposes the strict limits of AI governance. The human mind houses both the absolute darkest abyss and the highest heavenly architecture, and you just cannot govern that level of complexity if you ignore the warmth of human error.
The core takeaway we absolutely have to internalize is this: assuming that utilitarian algorithms can optimally manage society without integrating human error, compassion, and spiritual data is the peak nihilistic error. Relying on cold, calculated logic that treats human beings as mere mathematical machines isn't progress. It is the exact same predatory radicalization that the Russian soul exposed and unmasked back in 1860.
I want to leave you with this final thought to chew on as we keep building our algorithmic future. If pure, unchecked logic steered 19th century minds straight into absolute moral horror, we really have to ask ourselves,
Are our modern algorithms truly optimizing for human flourishing, or are they just programming us for blind compliance? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning the systems around you.